Okay, one of the things, we've got some people that are here, and we have some people that probably will be able to benefit later on from this as well. Elder Agate is working on getting some video recordings of what's going to transpire here, and I want you to write down a website, because that's where we're going to post at least the links to these videos, at least to begin with, and then we'll see where else it goes. But Sister Litchford has agreed that we can video and share this. So the website is www.selfreliance, and then it's bcss.com. That's for Brigham City South Stake.com. You're welcome to look there. We have that's where our regular newsletters go out and so on. But we'll also provide links to videos when we get those edited. Meanwhile, April Litchford is an extension assistant professor for Utah State University in Box Elder County. She's also a registered dietitian, nutritionist with a PhD in nutrition science. She has expertise in general nutritional counseling, child and family nutrition, and food safety. April has many years of experience preserving food at home and understands the science behind the current home food preservation recommendations. In her free time, she enjoys gardening, cooking, yoga, and helping others build habits necessary for optimal health and wellness. As I was visiting in the temple yesterday, I was talking with one of her friends from her ward. She says that she lives in Deweyville, and that she and her husband are great additions to the Deweyville community. So please join with me in welcoming Sister April Litchford to present.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm just going to get this started if my computer will cooperate. All right, so far, so good. Oh, whoops, go away. Okay. Well, thank you. That was such a nice introduction, and glad to know that I can do some good somewhere. So today I'm going to talk to you about home food preservation and the safe way to preserve food. I think a lot of people don't understand that. Well, in my experience at the Extension, there's a lot of misunderstanding about how we should be doing home food preservation. So I'm going to go over the basics and touch on some of the things that we know from science-based research that will help you to do this a little better and a little safer in your homes. Okay? So tell me a couple of reasons why people are interested in preserving food. Yeah, because peaches are only on 6 weeks a year, right? Which is not fair. I keep saying, Heavenly Father, you got to do this so we can have it like more than 6 weeks. Peaches are the best. So yeah, that's one of the reasons. To preserve excess, right? We have trees, we have gardens, and we get more food than we can eat. And so we want a way to preserve it. Why else do we want to preserve food? Yes?
Well, it's kind of the same idea, but if you don't have it all, you might have to just run to the grocery store, and you want to have better tasting.
Yeah, better tasting things you can control, right? We don't have it all the time. You had that thought.
Ferment stuff, sometimes you get stuff that you has a different flavor.
Okay, you can change the flavors, yeah. So you have more control over it. And there is, in our church, there's the thinking that we want to be prepared in case there is no way to get other food. Correct? And we have winter in Utah. Because we have winter in Utah, if you hadn't noticed, then we wouldn't have the ability to even grow food in the winter if there were no stores. So yeah, lots of reasons why we preserve food. So these are some of the ways we preserve food. And there are some other ones on a commercial level, but these are the ones that we can do typically commercially and at home. Okay, so those are the only ones that except for the irradiation of spices. I don't know anybody that has an irradiator. So I don't know if you know what that is. That's a way that we apply radiation to foods to kill bacteria, to preserve food for more time. So that one is a commercial product. I don't know if you can rent those, but I don't know. I guess we could look into that. Or even just the services. But most of the time what we do is we refrigerate or freeze food to preserve it. We dry it. We can do home canning. It's bottling, really. People sometimes are confused. They're like, wait, it's canning, but it's in a bottle. It's just kind of the way we say it, right? So in our society, we say canning, but we mean bottling. Salting and curing is another way. Pickling and fermenting, and then sweetening, okay? Or we're using sugar to preserve the food. Now, why do we do this? Well, contrary to a lot of people's belief or desire, food does not last forever, okay? So we have to do something to it or it will start to degrade and break down. Also, bacteria like food, just like humans like food. And because they like food, they grow in our food. So there is some concern that the way we treat our food and store our food can change the safety of that food. Is this something we should be concerned about? Yes. If you've ever had a foodborne illness, or think you did, you feel like you might gonna die, right? And it's miserable. And most of us have never had the serious foodborne illnesses that put people in the hospital and actually threaten their lives. But those are a thing, okay? They do happen. And because of that, we need to be a little more careful about how our food is treated and stored. Currently in the United States, there are 48 million cases of foodborne illness a year. And that's only the reported illnesses, okay? So there's a lot of foodborne illnesses that is occurring. 1 in 6 of us will get sick every year with some kind of illness that comes from the food we eat. That equals 128,000 hospitalizations and 3,000 deaths. So deaths are occurring because of bacteria and microorganisms that are in our food. So how do we prevent this and what do we do to keep our food as safe as possible? Well, for a long time, people didn't really know that bacteria could be passed in food. And so it's just only been the last about 100 years, 120 years that we have known how food and bacteria work together and that they can pass disease through food. And so we have learned that a couple of things that we do can change the ability of bacteria to grow. And one of the things is heat, right? The heat we apply to food can change the ability of bacteria to grow or its viability, so its ability to be alive. Okay, so we use heat. That's one of the reasons we cook food. We also use cold, right? Because in cold, most bacteria are inactivated. They can't grow. We also use low oxygen environments. Okay, so that's why we put foods in cans or in bottles, because there's no oxygen in there, and bacteria needs oxygen to grow. And then we change things like the acidity of the food. Bacteria can only grow in certain acidic environments. If it's too acidic, they won't grow. If there's not enough acid, they won't grow. Okay, it depends on the bacteria or the microorganism, but that is one thing that we alter. And we don't even realize we're doing this, right? But that's why we're doing it. And then the last thing that we do is we add things like salt and sugar, because those bind up water and they change the ability of bacteria to grow. So all that's really important to know, because when it comes to home canning and food preservation, we need to remember that canning is not cooking. So the food that we put into those bottles is the food we're going to get out of the bottles, and the quality of that food and how safe that food is before you put it in the bottle is going to matter. All right? Any questions on that? Okay. All right, so we're going to talk for just a little bit about why this is such a big deal. Most of the bacteria and microorganisms that are in our food, or potentially could be in our food, aren't really that big of a deal. They can make us sick, There are some serious ones like E. coli and salmonella that can lead to death. In the hospital, I counseled patients a couple times that had salmonella, and they'd been in the hospital for 3 to 4 weeks. So it can be pretty serious if you get salmonella. E. coli can also be the symptoms are bad. Really, you don't want them. They're very nasty. And it can also be very serious. But the one we're really worried about when it comes to home canning is botulism. So this is a condition that is caused by food poisoning, and it is an actual intoxication. So there is a little tiny spore, bacteria, microorganism, that's called Clostridium botulinum. And it lives in the dirt and in the soils. It blows in the air. It gets on your food, right? You cannot avoid it. It is there, okay? The Clostridium botulinum spore loves a certain environment. When it is in that certain environment, it grows very well, and it secretes a toxin that will kill humans. It is deadly, okay? And it is deadly at very low doses as well. So the environment that botulinum loves, Clostridium botulinum, because there's several different botulinums, the environment it loves is a low oxygen, room temperature, so 40 to like 100 degrees, 40 degrees to 100 degrees, environment that is mid-acid, so like around 5-6%, or 5 to 6 on the pH scale, so kind of a medium amount of acid, and enough water to grow. So what did I describe? Most of your bottled food, right? So it is the place for botulinum, Clostridium botulinum, to grow. And that is what we're concerned with, because the toxin that's produced by Clostridium botulinum is tasteless, it's odorless, you cannot see it, and you cannot smell it, and it will not typically change the condition of the food. So you won't see bubbles, you won't see like bulging of cans, those kinds of things. It doesn't really do that. It's a very silent killer. And so this is what we're worried about. Now, I have people call my office all the time and try to argue with me about botulinum, Clostridium botulinum. And I'm like, it's fine. Like, I'm going to give you the information. I'm going to tell you what I know. I'm going to tell you what science is telling us and the recommendations. But you have to make the choice. But this is deadly. And it is rare that someone will get a botulism toxin that will cause them either illness and hospitalization or death. But it does occur. And we had an incident in Weber County 4 years ago where 2 little twin girls were killed from botulism toxin. So it isn't something that is not happening. The CDC has between 10 and 15 fatal cases a year that they report. So it's happening in the United States, okay? And it can be prevented. We know how to prevent it. So we're going to go over how to do that now. Now first, there is a way to reverse-ish botulism toxin or botulism poisoning. So as soon as you think you might have it, you need to get to the hospital quickly because they have an antitoxin. They typically have to fly it from Washington, D.C. Because it's kept in a national center, but they can get it here. Once they get you the antitoxin, it usually can reverse the effects of the damage, but it also takes a great deal of rehabilitation. If someone gets a serious case of botulism poisoning, then it's typically they said 9 months to 12 months before you can function properly again. Okay, and what it does is it attacks your muscles, so like you get paralyzed is basically what happens. So people have to be intubated, they have to have physical therapy to relearn, it's nerve damage, it's pretty serious. Okay, so here's some of the symptoms. The biggest one people say is double vision or blurred vision is usually the first sign, and then they start not being able to talk and then move their arms and their limbs. So that's typically the most common signs of botulism poisoning. We hope that you don't ever get to the point where you have to do it. So a couple recommendations. Don't take a risk with food. When in doubt, throw it out. Okay, remember that, and I'm sure you all know that. When in doubt, throw it out. It's not worth it. I know it's money. I know it's an investment, but it's not worth it. So get rid of it if you're worried about it. Another thing that we need to really talk about, and I love our church, I love our culture, I love sharing, and we try to help each other, but we also have a lot of people that are using unsafe recipes that they pass to others, or they use unsafe recipes, they can the food, and then they pass that to others. And it can be extremely dangerous. There was a case in Ohio where a lady meant well. She bottled a whole bunch of potatoes. Potatoes are a vegetable. They are kind of a high-risk food when it comes to botulism. And she made potato salad with it, but she had improperly canned those potatoes, and she took it to a church dinner, and she infected 70 people, 5 of whom had to go to the hospital and had a long road to recovery. Okay, so we need to be thinking about where our recipes are coming from and asking people and making it common to be like, what recipe did you use? Where did you get your source? Before we take their food and taste it, okay? So I get people all the time that will give me canned foods, and I feel so bad, but it goes in the garbage most of the time because I don't know how they canned it. And we need to know how. So where do you find your recipes? These recipes are science-based, tested recipes that have gone through a rigorous program to know if, 1, they get hot enough to kill the microorganisms, and 2, if the product made from that recipe can sit on a shelf for over a year and not grow botulism. Okay, so it's more than just the process of doing it. It's does it sit and stay safe? So these recipes are backed by science and have had extensive research behind them. This book is from the National Center of Home Food Preservation, which is backed by the USDA. So it has funding and interest from the USDA. You can purchase these online, but there is also a website that has all of these recipes on it. And it is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. If you Google that, you will find it. National NCHFP, okay? Even if you do those letters, you will get it, okay? I had a question, yeah. Yes. And we're going to talk about why potatoes are such a problem in just a second, okay? Yes, it's the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And it's a website that it's free, and it's they want you to use it. And not only does it have recipes, but it also has information on how to use your pressure canner, your water bath canner, all of those things. It gives you step-by-step instructions. So it is an amazing resource. When I get calls at the extension, and I get calls all summer, so if you ever forget or need a question, just call me at the extension office and I will answer your question. Sometimes I'm not in the office, but I'll get back to you. This is where I send people, is to the National Center for Home Food Preservation, because they're always updating it. And right now, they just launched an app. Well, it's not an app, but it's a mobile version of this website that's really easy to use on your phone as well, or a tablet. So this is a great place to go. You can also purchase this. Utah State, you can get on our extension website and order products, and you can order this book in a spiral bound, and it's about $20. Okay? And I have a copy of it in the room, in the Relief Society room, if you want to come and look at it. So this is what the website, this is what it used to look like. It's red and black now, but it's pretty much the same thing, okay? And you can just go through, it'll give you all the recipes for any food you're canning. What do you do if there's not a recipe on the website? Should you just make it work with another recipe? No. If there's not a recipe for it, chances are you cannot can it. All right? It is not an approved product for canning, for home canning. If you have a question about that, sometimes I can find recipes in other places, but this is so comprehensive. If you can't find it on there, it's not cannable. For example, people want to can ham. I get people who ask me that. I'm like, can's already cured, or ham is already cured. Why do you want to home can it? Anyway, so we have that discussion. No, you cannot preserve cured foods in a bottle. There's no safe recipe for that. So that's one example. Another place to go is our extension website. You can just go to Preserve the Harvest, and it'll bring us up. Preserve the Harvest USU, or just Preserve the Harvest. We have all kinds of fact sheets on there. We have recipes, and we also have links to direct you to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. So if you can't remember all that, just go to Preserve the Harvest. And we're always putting new things out. Like we just barely had a low sugar jelly recipe that was published. So if you want to know how to do that, it's on our website. This is another approved book. It's called So Easy to Preserve. Some of you may have this. This has been around for a long time, like I think in the 80s, 70s or 80s. So it's been around a long time. This one you have to purchase online. And if you go to Amazon, it's going to cost a lot of money. You have to go straight to the University of Georgia's website, University of Georgia Extension website, and you can buy this one there. But you can Google this one and you'll find how to purchase it. Yeah, that one, excuse me, so the So Easy to Preserve has more fancy recipes in it. So like how to do like cinnamon peaches or pickled peaches. Yeah, so that and So Easy to Preserve, you'll find those recipes there. And these are also from the University of Georgia, which works on the National Center for Home Food Preservation website. So these are good recipes, well tested. Oh, sorry, I didn't go back. Then there's always also the Blue Book. Who has a Ball Blue Book? Yeah, safe. That's usually the most common. You can get these at Walmart for like $17. They're always there. They look a little bit different. They just got a new version that came out about a month ago. I think they're in the stores. They're close, but they've got a new version. But anyway, so Ball is a good company for the most part. They have really good and safe recipes. The only thing I would say with Ball is be careful that you read all of the instructions, because some of the recipes Ball puts in their books are not cannable. Like you can't put them in a bottle and can them and keep them at room temperature. Some of their recipes you have to keep in the refrigerator. So it's really important that you read all of the instructions in the Ball book. But they also have some supplemental books like this Home Preserving, and that's where a lot of those other recipes are, where people will have crocked pickles or sauerkrauts that have to be in a fridge, but they can't be canned or home bottled, okay? So Ball is a good source. They also have these two, so they've come out with a whole line of canning books. If you are just really into it and want to have a good time trying to do some new recipes, you can get in there and see some of the new flavors. And they also have a website. Okay, so remember Ball. Ball is a good source. Also, if you buy any of like the Ball products or MCP or, I'm trying to remember, Mrs. Fields, is it called? No, not Mrs. Fields. There's another brand called Mrs. Something that's like a pickling spice. Wait, thank you, Mrs. Gages. I was thinking cookies for some reason. I must be hungry. Okay, so it's Mrs. Gages. They have recipes on the packages, and those are okay to use. All right? So if you get a pectin and it has a recipe in there, yep, those are good. Those have been science-based and tested. So you can use the ones in those kinds of packaging as well. All right, the things you cannot use are grandma's favorite recipe, the recipe your friend gave you, or one you made up, okay? Those are the ones we do not use in canning. However, I will have people call me and they'll say, hey, this is my grandma's recipe. I love it. I want to do something very similar to it, but I know I need to use a safe recipe. Can you help me? And I will go into some of my canning books, and guess what? 9 times out of 10, I find them in the canning book. So they think it's grandma's recipe, but grandma's been using a research-based recipe. So if you have a question, you can call me and we can look into that. All right, so how do we can? There are 2 basic canning methods. The first is, first of all, what we use when we can is jars and 2-part lids. Okay, if you can see this, we have the rings and the flats. And that's important to know because the flats are the rubber seal. That's what's sealing the jar and making that vacuum that keeps it safe, okay? These are single-use lids. Okay, I'm going to say that again. I'm just checking my time. These are single-use lids. When we had COVID hit and we had supply chain problems, we had people using lids multiple times. I would have people call me and say, oh, well, they cleaned up good and they sealed just fine. They may have sealed, but you do not know if the seal is integral, and these are single-use lids. So they need to be discarded after they have been used to seal a jar. That includes if you try to process some of your foods and some of your lids don't seal in a batch. If you choose to reprocess those foods, that lid needs to be discarded and a new one needs to be used, okay? Because really what happens, the rubber is only made to be heated once and cooled once, and that's what creates the seal. After that, it is no longer capable of doing that safely. Okay, so we use usually a disposable lid and a ring and then a glass jar. Now, I know that there's an old practice of keeping glass mayonnaise jars to preserve food in. This is a no-no, okay? Those are not made for high pressure or high heat canning. So if you have any of those mayonnaise jars, please throw them away. The only jars that we recommend that you use are Ball and Kerr and Golden Harvest jars. The other jars have not been tested at the same rigor, and we do not know how they will function, one, and two, how they will store food. So the best ones are Ball, Kerr, and Golden Harvest. Golden Harvest is actually a product of Ball, so that's why we do that one. But there's a lot of other jars out there that I've been seeing, and they are not. If you're doing a jam, that'll be okay for that, but if you're doing anything with any of these other processing methods, they are not okay. Any questions on that? Okay, the bottles are reusable, so you don't have to throw those away. I had a lady once say, well, you said it was one-time use. No, the bottles are more than one-time use, but the lids, the rings are more than one-time use as well. It's just the flats. Yes?
How long can you keep the flats? How long can you sit on, like, if you don't use them all 1 year?
Right.
Can you use them for several years?
So the company Ball and Kerr and Golden Harvest only guarantee the seals, the rubber seal on those lids for 18 months. But most people get a decent seal for 2 years past their expiration date. Just know the company is telling you you should only use them 1 year past the expiration date. And that brings me to bottled foods that you have bottled. It is the same on those bottled foods. The food should be used within a year, 2 years max. If they are not, you run the risk of having that seal fail and introducing bacteria and microorganisms into that food. There are so many people who hate it when I say that, because 2 years really is max on home canned food. And the point of home canning food really is preserving what's in the season, right? Eating it during the off season and then being ready to preserve again. So only preserve what you can eat in a year. Okay. All right, so these are some of the canning tools, and I have examples of these in the room if you want to come and see them. They're not necessary, but they're helpful because you have boiling water and hot steam, so these bottles come out hot. So you need a way to lift them out. You need a way to help get the bubbles out of the jar so they'll seal properly, and so all of these help with that. So these are available at any store. But yeah, come talk to me if you have more questions about those. Now, how do we decide? There's two different types of home canning methods. So there's water bath canning and there's pressure canning. So how do we decide which one to use? It all comes down to the acidity of the food. Because Clostridium botulinum can only grow in that medium acid range, okay? And boiling water temperatures will not inactivate botulism, the botulism spore. So we have to decide at what acidity do we use pressure canning. Pressure canning will push the heat of the processing up to 240 degrees. In Utah, we only boil water at 204 degrees. So there's a big difference, right, between the water bath and the pressure canning. So water bath, we can do anything that has high acid in it, all right? So if there's a lot of acid in that food, then it's going to be fine. It's not going to grow botulism because it can't grow in those acidic temperatures. Now, we get confused because the pH scale is what we use to measure acidity, and that is the active hydrogen that's in a food. That's what pH stands for. And so the scale goes down, the pH scale goes down as the acidity rises. Okay, so it's a little backwards. So the lower pH, the higher the acid. Okay, so you can see on this, and it is small, and I'm so sorry. So right here is a 3, and a 4, and a 5. So these are higher acid foods. Strong acid is at a 3, and then lower acid at a 5. So the foods in the 3 to 4 zone are all of our fruits. Okay, fruits are great. They can go in a water bath. They have a pH that's much lower than 4 usually, and so they're not a worry. When we get from the 4 to the 5 zone, that's when we start to get a little worried because it's just too close. Clostridium botulinum can start to produce toxin at a 4.6 pH. So you're just kind of in that zone. So out of an abundance of caution, we recommend that you keep your pH below 4. Okay? And that's why tomatoes have a different way of processing than other foods. Because tomatoes used to be super acidic. They are a fruit. The natural form of a tomato is acidic, like a peach or a pear. But because of genetic modification and the fact that we want less acid in our tomatoes, they are not as acidic as they used to be. So now we have to acidify tomatoes and tomato products to make sure they stay in the safe range. Okay, and we'll talk about that. Now, once you get past that 4 and you're going into the 5s and the 6, we have all of our vegetables. All right, so any vegetable is in that, got to be higher than a water bath canner. Okay? Okay, so that's how we would determine what method to use. So water bath canning, it's like it says. We fill our jars, we follow the recipe, we put it in a water bath, which will cover the jar at least 1 to 2 inches. So really, with this kind of a technique, all you need is a stock pot, some kind of pot that's going to have enough water in it to cover the jar to 1 to 2 inches above that lid and come to a boil. You do not have to have a water bath canner to do that. You can use a stock pot, you can use a soup pot, as long as you can get enough water in there to cover that bottle 1 to 2 inches. Okay? We get our bottles in there. We get it up to heat. We get it to a rolling boil. It has to be at a rolling boil. And then we start our timer for processing. Does anybody know what happens if we lose our boil during the processing time? You start over. Thank you. You don't just get it back up to the boil and then start where you were. You start the whole process over. So just be aware. Don't lose your boil because you don't want to start it all over again. Like tomatoes, some tomatoes are like 90 minutes. So you don't want to do that, okay? But yeah, it's pretty simple. That's water bath, okay? Yeah.
Every year my wife, she'll run that pressure cooker for 45 or 50 or 60 or 90 minutes. And every year she burns up my big units, about $50.
Yep.
So this last year I actually went out and bought just a small 1-unit camshaft. Love it.
Do you,
Outside.
one question on that though. So you're using pressure canner or water bath canner? Okay, so pressure canner, it can actually warp the bottom of a pressure canner to put it on a, sorry to burst your bubble, to put it on a camshaft. It depends. So if you know of a camshaft, the flame of a camshaft goes right into the middle of the pot. There are diffusers that they sell that can diffuse it out, and that can actually protect your pressure canner from the bowing. But if you're using an All-American, which is nice, big, heavy steel, then you don't really have to worry about it as much. But most people use a Presto, which is a lighter aluminum, so it will bow. And then another thing he said outside, what's the worry about doing something outside? The wind. They'll either blow out your heat and you lose your boil, or your pressure, or it will cool your canner, right? The heat will still be coming up, but the wind will cool your canner. So those are just a couple of things to think about where you're canning them. Yes? Okay, yep, I have that on here. We'll talk about that. So there's a couple water baths available. You can buy just the typical like metal one that you've probably seen. There's also this new electric one, which is wonderful. It is a game changer. Like, I love it. It has a higher capacity, so I can stack 2 pints in there. I can put 3 sets of half pints, and it sits on your counter, and it boils so quickly, and it's amazing. They are about $75 to $80, but if you do a lot of water bath canning, these are a game changer. They are so nice. Okay, pressure canning. So in a pressure canner, we are using pressure to can the food, to process the food, not water. Okay, now we do put water in the pressure canner to create the steam and the pressure, but we don't use water to do the moving of the heat. Okay, so a mistake I see often is people will take their pressure canner, they will fill it up above their food like we would in a water bath canner. They'll put water above the food and then try to pressure can it. But that is not correct. It actually it is not the purpose of a pressure canner. So in a pressure canner, you only want 2 to 3 inches of water in the bottom, just enough so it can maintain the steam and not boil out, but you do not want it covering your bottles. Okay. Now these are a little bit more scary for people, and there's a lot of information online how to use them safely and properly. And truly, if you maintain your pressure canner and you are careful with how you do the processes, they do not blow up. They have safety releases. They are very, very safe, but you have to do the maintenance, and you have to make sure that the ports are clear, that your seals are good, that your gauges are good in order to make sure it's functioning properly. Okay? So there's 2 types of pressure canners. You can do a weighted gauge pressure canner. That one will always pressurize at 15 pounds. So anything that you cook will be at 15 pounds of pressure. And then there's also a gauge pressure canner. Some of them will have both. Okay, so like a Presto has both. It has a rocking gauge and a rocking weight and a gauge. The gauges make it so that you can pressure can your food at 13 pounds pressure in Utah, where we live here. Okay, we need to use 13 pounds of pressure. However, those gauges are not always accurate. Okay, it may say 13, but it's really only doing it at 11 or 12, which doesn't get it hot enough to kill that botulinum spore. So we recommend that you get your gauge tested once a year. And I have a tester at my office in the county office building, which is just on Main Street, at the top of Main Street. You can bring your gauge there, or bring your whole lid if you have it, and then we can test them for you and tell you how accurate that gauge is. Okay? All right, so this is the process for pressure canning. We're basically going to get the water in there, the food in there. We're going to get it up to heat, all right, till we start to see steam coming out of the vent port. When we see the steam coming out of the vent port, you want to let the steam run for 10 minutes. Okay, once you see a nice good plume of steam, set a timer for 10 minutes. Allow it to vent for 10 minutes. This is equalizing the temperature inside the pressure canner. It's a very crucial and important step to make sure you don't have any cold pockets in your canner. Once it goes for 10 minutes, you'll close the port, you'll get it to pressure, and you'll hold it at that pressure. Once it holds at that pressure, you start your timer. Okay, and then the same thing for this one. If you lose pressure, you have to start the whole thing over. Okay? Okay. But it really isn't too bad. You can do meats. Meats would fall in a pressure canner. Vegetables fall in a pressure canner. In a water bath, we're going to do fruits like peaches, pears, apples, apple sauces. In a water bath, you can also do pickling because we're adding acid. So you can do pickles, relishes in a water bath. You can do salsas in a water bath as long as you use an approved recipe that acidifies the tomatoes. So we're going to have to add acid to our salsas, always. And then we have to add acid to our tomatoes, but they can be done in a water bath. Okay, so For pressure canning, it's only the things we can't add acid to that won't have enough acid. We got to get them hot enough. Now, our atmospheric steam canner that was just asked about. So these are a great invention because and my mom actually used these a lot when I was a kid growing up. And so like I used them, I knew how to use them. The problem with an atmospheric steam canner is that they run out of water. So if you see at the bottom, that little thing at the bottom is only about this deep. And so you can only put so much water in there. And so these can only be used for high acid foods. So that would be peaches, pears, apples. And it has to be a processing time less than 40 minutes or less, because you lose your water at 40 minutes, okay? Your steam will no longer be happening. And you can't take it off, put more water in, get it to steam, put it back on, and finish your time. You have to start over if you lose your steam. So they're not the greatest thing, unless you just want to use them for peaches, pears, and apples, okay? Because that's the only one at our atmosphere, at our altitude, that we can do in 35 to 40 minutes. Everything else needs 40 to 45 or 50. So you can't do them in a steam canner, or this atmospheric canner. Any questions on that? Okay. Okay, like I said, we have to acidify tomatoes. If you're using an approved, let me say it that way, when you use your approved recipe for salsas or sauces with tomatoes, you will add acid most of the time. There are 2 recipes in the USDA book, the National Center for Home Food Preservation book, that allow you to cook down the tomatoes. So there's a taco sauce and a spaghetti sauce that you put in like really big bulk, and then you cook it down to about 2/3, or cook about 1/3 of the liquid off. And then you can bottle it safely in a pressure canner without adding acid. But that is because it's acidified as it's boiled the water off. And that usually takes 4 to 6 hours to do that, okay? The other ones, you are going to have to add acid to keep it safe at room temperature. If you have a salsa you love and you don't want to add acid to it and you want to store it, it needs to go in the freezer, okay? The same procedures for a salsa recipe do not go the same for one without acid, okay? Salsa is actually the #1 food that intoxicates people with botulism toxin. It's salsa, okay? So you got to use an approved recipe or put it in a freezer, okay? I have people all the time that say, I want it to taste like the fresh pico de gallo. Like, well, then you're going to have to make fresh pico de gallo. That doesn't sit on a shelf, okay? So that's the thing. It is different because we have to process it to keep it safe. When you're doing just regular tomatoes, you do need to acidify them. They just aren't the same variety. It depends on their ripeness also, how acidic they are. So just to make sure they're safe and to keep you and your family safe, you need to acidify your tomatoes when you bottle them, okay? And here's the formula. You can use lemon juice. You can also use vinegar, but I don't like that because it changes the flavor. So you can use lemon juice. However, you need to use bottled lemon juice that you buy at the store that's on the shelf. Because the bottled lemon juice has been, it has the same acidity level, so it's standardized, okay? You're gonna get a 5% acidity every time you buy lemon juice. But if you squeeze it at home from lemons you have, you don't know for sure if it's gonna be 5% acidity, okay? So 2 tablespoons of lemon juice per quart, 1 tablespoon per pint, and then you can also use citric acid. So that's a ½ teaspoon per quarter per pint. It's difficult to find citric acid. You can purchase it online. You will get a 5-pound bag, so you will get a ton, and it doesn't take very much. It does last for a really long time, though. I did find a smaller bottle, about this big, like a spice bottle, at Walmart last year. So just kind of watch. Sometimes you can find it in smaller amounts. Or get your Relief Society together and buy a huge thing of citric acid and share. Yes? Okay, so it was on the shelves by the canning products. Sometimes pharmacies can order it in as well, so you can ask a pharmacist. Okay? Any questions on acidifying tomatoes? And this needs to happen every time, every time. Okay, we're almost out of it. Yes? You don't. If you've acidified them, you can follow the recipe for water bath canning, and you don't have to do the 90 minutes in a pressure canner. But even if you decide to do your tomatoes in a pressure canner, you need to put acid in them. Yes. So I tell people, don't pressure can them, because they're going to get more mushy in a pressure canner because it's a higher temperature. And you can do the same effect in a water bath. But just, you got to acidify them. You can buy the citric acid or just lemon juice. And I typically just use lemon juice. It does not change the flavor enough that it matters. Any questions? Okay. Okay, before we're done, I got to talk about altitude adjustment. All of the recipes in the ball book, in the So Easy to Preserve book, will tell you time and a pressure based on altitude at sea level. Okay? When we go up in altitude, which we are at 4,400 and something feet in Brigham City, okay? So we're 4,000 feet, almost 5,000 feet above sea level. We do not boil water as hot as people boil it at sea level. It's just how it is. We don't have as much atmospheric pressure, so we boil it at a lower temperature where we are. It also takes longer to cook food where we live because of the atmospheric pressure. So we have to increase the amount of time for water bath canning in Utah to get it hot enough. And we have to increase the pounds of pressure in Utah because of the heat. Same thing with pressure, okay? So you'll look in the So Easy to Preserve book and it's going to say process at 10 pounds of pressure for this many minutes. No, okay? In Utah, you have to process everything at 13 pounds of pressure. So in Brigham, all along the Wasatch Front, it's 13 pounds. If you get out into other areas, like Washington County, so St. George, they're like at 2,000 feet. So you can do it lower there. Monticello's at 7,000 feet. So you have to do it at 14 pounds pressure. So you need to know what your altitude is. So I'm telling you here, everything's at 13 in Brigham City. Okay? What can you not can? Unsafe recipes. Y'all should have said that. What can you not can? Grandma's recipe. Unsafe recipes, okay? Your own recipe. You cannot can those. Well, you can. You should not. I should change this to say you should not. Other things you should not can. Butter. You cannot can butter. All right? It's too thick. We can't move the temperature through the butter, and it's true for anything that's that thick, okay? Plus, butter is not made to be canned, okay? It's just not. Put it in the freezer, and if we have a crisis and we can't get butter, we'll all be sad, but we're not going to have butter because you can't keep it in a jar, okay? Hydrated wheat kernels are another thing you cannot can. I think this trend has fallen out, so people aren't typically doing it as much, but it is better to store your wheat in a dry form. I don't know why people want to hydrate these and then can them, but it's the same concept. We can't move the heat through the kernels, and there's not a safe recipe for this. Quick breads. This is actually one of the worst things you can do. We'll have people, this is what they'll do. They will put quick bread batter in a bottle, and then they'll put it in a water bath canner. It will cook the bread and preserve it. And then they put it on a shelf. 6 months later, they take it out and eat it. And in the middle of that bread, what have we done? Well, we've probably encouraged salmonella to grow because there's raw egg in that. We've probably even E. coli, and specifically botulism, okay? Because you cannot heat it properly. So this is a no-no. If you want to put quick breads in a mason jar and bake it in your oven and give it as a cute gift, great. But do not seal it in a canner and think it will be safe on a shelf. Dry beans. So this is another thing. People try to put dry beans in a jar without water and seal the jar and then think it's safe. It is not safe. If you would like to can beans, you need to rehydrate them first, cook them about halfway, then put them in a bottle with new water, follow the recipe, and pressure can them. And then you have beans, just like you would get in a can in the store, okay? But they do require some cooking in order to get them hot enough to keep them safe. All right, and then another thing I always get asked, can I mess with the spices? Do I have to put in as much salt or oregano that the recipe says? The answer is no, okay? The salt is not a preserving thing for most foods, except in the case of pickling, okay? You do not want to decrease the salt in pickling because that is what is making the pickle, okay? The vinegar preserves the pickle, but the salt is what makes the pickle. Okay, helps make the pickle. But you can, up to 2 tablespoons per quart, you can change spices, dry spices. We do not recommend that you use any fresh spices because they do not hold up well to high heat. But yes, you can put cumin in there, your salsa. You can put oregano in your spaghetti sauce. Yes, that's fine. You can reduce the salt. Now, with jams and jellies, should you reduce the sugar? No, because the sugar is what changes the gel. It's what gives it its consistency. Okay, so follow recipes on jams and jellies. Do not change sugar contents on those or you'll get runny jelly. But if you have a low sugar jelly recipe, it's compensated for that. Okay, any questions? I know we're pretty much out of time. I can run through the food storage do's and don'ts really fast. We have about 4 minutes unless you have questions. Yes.
Are there foods, this is not about this kind of canning, but using the vacuum freezer dryers that people have, are there foods that you shouldn't do in those machines?
Yeah, so with vacuum, so if a food needs to be refrigerated and you use a vacuum sealer, it still needs to be refrigerated or frozen. Does that make sense? So like you can't vacuum seal raw meat and then put it on your shelf. Okay, so it can preserve the life of food in a freezer for sure if you vacuum seal it because you're removing oxygen. If you have done food where you have dehydrated it and taken the water out, so like apple slices or raisins or whatever, vacuum sealing is great because it will help keep the oxygen and moisture out of that food. So those are really good for that. Dry beans is another one people will vacuum seal in mason jars, and that's great. If you're just removing oxygen to store a dry food, yes. Or you're removing oxygen to store a food in a fridge or a freezer for a longer amount of time, yes. Vacuum sealers are good.
What about raw eggs?
So raw eggs should never be stored except in a freezer. Okay? Yes?
Somebody gives you a bottle of soup, hamburger soup, and it comes in your freezer, and how long does it take? It can be frozen forever.
Okay, so this is, and I have a slide about freezing really quick. We'll just talk really fast. So freezing is a process of reducing temperatures to a point where that microorganisms cannot grow, and most microorganisms cannot grow at 0 degrees and below. Okay, we typically, our inside freezers, so like our fridge freezers, are between 0 and 30 degrees. So sometimes they do not preserve food as long. If you have it in a deep freeze that is set at 0, so it's at 0 or below, then food technically can last indefinitely. Okay. But you have to know a couple of things. One, did it stay at that temperature consistently? Did we ever lose power? Did someone ever leave the door open? Like, did it ever raise above that? And then is the food, what is the quality of the food going to be like? So the FDA, Federal Drug Administration, and the USDA recommend that in a freezer for the best quality and safety, because you're never quite sure if that kept its freeze, right? I was a little worried. No food should be stored longer than a year for quality. But there is a website, and we have it on our Home Food Preserve the Harvest website that shows you specifically for each food. So like if you froze peaches, how long? And that's about 6 months. You can keep them to a year, but like I was noticing last week, my peaches that I preserved in the summer, they're not looking so hot. They're browning already, okay? So it's a quality thing. But if you can keep it at 0 degrees, yeah, it's safe, indefinitely. But you always have to wonder, did it stay there?
And
Yes. So you will need to always do it at the 15. So there's a 10 and there's a 15. If you look, some of the pressure counters on the bottom, it will say 10, and on the top, it'll say 15, or it will have rings like you have. You always want to do it at 15 for Utah. Never take them off. You're welcome. All right, any other questions? Okay. Also, please remember, food doesn't last forever, okay? We recommend that you keep it to the best by date on the can when you're buying canned commercial products, no longer than 2 years, okay? In theory, yes, they can stay safe. Your quality is drastically reduced at 2 years, okay? All right, well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you. Yeah, thanks. If you have more questions, just see me in the room back there for a little bit.